Mr. Reeves, what was your full name during your time in the military?
Franklin James Reeves, Your Honor, but my squad, they called me Sergeant Rock.
Homeless veteran faced the judge. Then a name was read that made the courtroom stand still. Franklin Reeves stood before the bench in clothes that reeked of the streets, facing theft charges that could send him to jail for stealing a loaf of bread. The packed courtroom saw only another vagrant clogging the system, but when Judge Alan Whitmore read the defendant's full name aloud, his voice caught in his throat. 47 years melted away in an instant, and suddenly the distinguished judge was remembering a muddy foxhole in Vietnam where a young staff sergeant had saved his life. What happened next would remind everyone present that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear the invisible wounds of war. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 4A cast harsh shadows across the scarred wooden benches where the dregs of society waited their turn before Judge Alan Whitmore's bench. It was Thursday morning in downtown Los Angeles, and the docket was packed with the usual parade of petty crimes, shoplifting, public intoxication, vagrancy, and the endless cycle of poverty-driven desperation that filled the city's courts. Franklin Reeves sat in the back row, his weathered hands folded in his lap, trying to make himself invisible among the other defendants. At 66, he looked older, his gray beard unkempt, his clothes a collection of donations and dumpster finds that carried the permanent smell of the streets. The orange jumpsuit he wore for his court appearance was probably the cleanest thing he'd worn in months. Around him, the courtroom buzzed with the mechanical efficiency of justice processed in bulk. Public defenders shuffled through files they'd barely had time to read. Prosecutors rattled off charges with the bored precision of people who'd said the same words thousands of times. Families sat in the gallery, some crying, others angry, most just tired. Franklin kept his eyes down, avoiding the curious stares of other defendants and the judgmental glances of court personnel. He'd learned long ago that eye contact invited questions he didn't want to answer, conversations that led to pity or suspicion. Better to remain invisible, just another piece of human debris swept through the system. The charges against him were simple petty theft, specifically stealing a loaf of bread from Martinez Market on Figueroa Street. The security footage was clear. Franklin had walked into the store, taken the bread from the shelf, and walked out without paying. When confronted by the store owner, he'd simply stood there, not running, not fighting, just accepting whatever consequences would follow. Judge Whitmore presided over the proceedings with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of human failure over his 23 years on the bench. At 68, he was nearing retirement, his distinguished gray hair and measured demeanor marking him as one of the courthouse's most respected jurists. He'd built his reputation on fairness, tempered with pragmatism, understanding that the law served justice best when applied with wisdom, rather than rigid adherence to procedure. Case number 2025 CM 8847, the clerk announced. People versus Franklin James Reeves. Charges of petty theft in the third degree. Franklin stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and shuffled toward the defendant's table, where his overworked public defender waited with a file that contained more questions than answers. Mr. Reeves, Judge Whitmore said, looking down at the file before him, you're charged with theft of property valued at less than $50. How do you plead? Franklin's public defender, a young woman named Sarah Chin, who looked like she'd graduated law school, the previous week, stood up beside him. "Your Honor, my client pleads guilty. We're requesting consideration for time served and community service in lieu of additional jail time." Judge Whitmore nodded, having heard similar pleas dozens of times that morning. But something about this case made him pause. He looked more closely at the defendant, the way Franklin stood at attention despite his obvious frailty, the unconscious military bearing that decades of civilian life hadn't quite erased. "Mr. Reeves," the judge said, "the report indicates you're homeless. Do you have any family in the area? Any support system?" Franklin's voice was barely audible when he spoke. "No, Your Honor, just me. Employment history. Various jobs over the years, Your Honor. Nothing recent." Judge Whitmore studied the file more carefully, noting the sparse details of Franklin's background. No prior arrests, no history of violence, no indication of substance abuse. Just a man who'd stolen bread because he was hungry. "Mr. Reeves, have you ever served in the military?" The question seemed to surprise Franklin, who looked up for the first time since entering the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor. Army. Long time ago." "What was your rank and unit?" Franklin hesitated as if the memories were painful to access. "Staff Sergeant, 1st Infantry Division, Vietnam." Judge Whitmore felt something stir in his memory, a familiar sensation that he couldn't quite place. "What years did you serve?" 1968 to 1971, Your Honor, 2 tours. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Reeves, what was your full name during your service?" "Franklin James Reeves, Your Honor. Some people called me Frank, but my squad, they called me Sergeant Rock." The file slipped from Judge Whitmore's hands, papers scattering across his bench. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with quiet conversations and shuffling papers, fell silent as everyone noticed the judge's sudden change in demeanor. "Sergeant Rock," Judge Whitmore repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "1st Infantry Division, Firebase Charlie, 1970. Franklin's head snapped up, his eyes meeting the judge's for the first time. For a moment, the years fell away, and instead of a homeless man in an orange jumpsuit, Judge Whitmore saw a young staff sergeant in jungle fatigues, his face streaked with mud and determination. "Lieutenant Whitmore," Franklin said, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Alan Whitmore." The courtroom erupted in confused murmurs as the two men stared at each other across 4 decades of separation. Judge Whitmore stood up slowly, his judicial composure cracking as memories flooded back, memories of a terrified young lieutenant pinned down by enemy fire, of a staff sergeant who'd crawled through a rice paddy under heavy fire to reach him, of strong hands dragging him to safety while bullets whistled overhead. "Bailiff," Judge Whitmore said, his voice shaking slightly, "clear the courtroom, everyone except Mr. Reeves and his counsel." "Your Honor," the prosecutor started to object. "This is highly irregular." "Clear the courtroom," Judge Whitmore repeated, his tone brooking no argument. As the gallery emptied and court personnel filed out, Franklin remained standing at the defendant's table, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. Sarah Chen looked between her client and the judge with growing confusion, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. When the courtroom was empty, except for the 3 of them, Judge Whitmore stepped down from his bench and walked toward Franklin, his judicial robes seeming suddenly incongruous with the emotion on his face. "Frank," he said simply. "My God, Frank, what happened to you?" The reunion between the judge and the homeless veteran unfolded like a scene from a different world, one where the formal boundaries of the courtroom dissolved in the face of shared history and profound gratitude. Judge Whitmore stood before Franklin, no longer the imposing figure of judicial authority, but simply a man confronting someone who had saved his life. "Your Honor," Sarah Chen said carefully, "I don't understand what's happening here." Judge Whitmore turned to the young public defender, his eyes still bright with unshed tears. "Ms. Chen, your client saved my life in Vietnam. Firebase Charlie March, 15th, 1970. I was a second lieutenant, green as grass, and I'd made a tactical error that got my squad pinned down by enemy fire." He looked back at Franklin, who stood quietly, his military bearing more evident now despite his disheveled appearance. Sergeant Reeves crawled 200 yards through a rice paddy under heavy fire to reach our position. He organized our defense, called in artillery support, and personally carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety, including me. Franklin's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "You were hit in the shoulder, sir. Kept trying to go back for your radio operator." "Private Martinez?" Judge Whitmore said the name coming back with startling clarity. "You wouldn't let me go back for him." "He was already gone, Lieutenant. You would have been too if you'd tried." The weight of that long-ago decision hung in the air between them. Judge Whitmore had spent years wondering about the men he'd served with, particularly the staff sergeant who'd saved his life and then disappeared into the chaos of a war that America was trying to forget. "Frank," Judge Whitmore said, "I looked for you after the war. I wanted to thank you properly to make sure you got the recognition you deserved, but your records were incomplete." Franklin nodded slowly. "A lot of records got lost, sir, or buried. Some of us preferred it that way." "Why, you were a hero, Frank. You saved lives." For the first time since the recognition had occurred, Franklin's composure cracked slightly. "Heroes don't usually end up stealing bread, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore felt the full weight of the tragedy before him, a decorated war veteran reduced to homelessness, facing criminal charges for the simple act of trying to eat. The contrast between the man who'd saved his life and the defendant standing before him was almost too painful to bear. "Ms. Chen," Judge Whitmore said, turning back to the public defender, "I need to recuse myself from this case due to personal involvement. But before I do, I want to understand how we got here." He looked at Franklin with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for decades. "Frank, what happened after Vietnam? Where have you been?" Franklin was quiet for a long moment, his hands working nervously at the hem of his jumpsuit. "Came home in '71, got married to a wonderful woman named Dorothy. Had a good life for a while, worked construction, bought a house, thought about having kids." His voice grew softer. "Dorothy got sick about 5 years ago. Cancer. Took everything we had to pay for treatments, and she still didn't make it." Judge Whitmore felt his heart breaking for the man who'd once been his salvation. "I'm sorry, Frank. I'm so sorry. After she died, I couldn't stay in that house. Couldn't keep pretending that life made sense anymore. So I gave everything away and started walking. Been walking ever since." "But your military benefits, your pension, surely you qualified for—" Franklin shook his head. "Paperwork got too complicated after Dorothy died. Felt like I was fighting the war all over again just to prove I existed. Easier to just disappear." Sarah Chen had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement and horror. "Mr. Reeves, You're entitled to significant benefits as a combat veteran. Housing assistance, medical care, disability compensation. I know what I'm entitled to miss, Franklin said gently. But sometimes what you're entitled to and what you can actually get are two different things. Judge Whitmore made a decision that would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. Frank, I'm dismissing these charges. More than that, I'm going to make some phone calls. You're not going back to the streets. Your Honor, Franklin protested, I don't need charity. This isn't charity, Judge Whitmore interrupted firmly. This is a debt I've owed for 47 years, and I'm finally in a position to pay it. He turned to Sarah Chen. Ms. Chen, I'm going to ask you to continue representing Mr. Reeves, but not as a public defender. I'm retaining you personally to help him navigate the VA system and reclaim the benefits he's earned. Sir, Franklin said, his voice breaking, you don't owe me anything. I was just doing my job. Judge Whitmore stepped closer, placing a hand on Franklin's shoulder. Frank, you gave me a life. You gave me the chance to come home, to go to law school, to become a judge, to have a family. Everything I've accomplished, everything I've become exists because you crawled through that rice paddy to save a scared kid who didn't know what he was doing. Tears were flowing freely down both men's faces now. The least I can do is make sure you have a place to sleep tonight. But the path to redemption proved more complicated than Judge Whitmore had anticipated. 3 days after the courtroom reunion, Franklin sat in the waiting room of the VA regional office, surrounded by forms that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Despite Sarah Chen's best efforts to navigate the bureaucracy, they'd hit wall after wall of red tape, missing documents, and systemic indifference. Mr. Reeves, the VA claims representative said, looking up from her computer screen with the expression of someone who delivered bad news 1,000 times before. I'm showing gaps in your service record. Without complete documentation, we can't process your benefits application. Franklin stared at the woman across the desk, feeling the familiar weight of institutional rejection. Ma'am, I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I have my discharge papers. The discharge papers show honorable service, but they don't detail your combat experience or any injuries sustained. For disability benefits, we need medical records from your time in service. Sarah Chen leaned forward. Ms. Patterson, those records are nearly 50 years old. Many Vietnam-era documents were destroyed in the 1973 fire at the National Personnel Record Center. I understand that, counselor, but without documentation, our hands are tied. Mr. Reeves could file an appeal, but the process typically takes 18 to 24 months. Franklin felt something inside him break. 24 months. He'd be lucky to survive 24 weeks on the streets, especially as winter approached. The brief hope that had flickered to life in Judge Whitmore's courtroom was dying, smothered by the same bureaucratic indifference that had driven him to the streets in the first place. There has to be something we can do, Sarah insisted. Judge Whitmore is willing to provide testimony about Mr. Reeves's service. Judicial testimony isn't sufficient for VA benefits determination, Patterson replied with the mechanical precision of someone reciting policy. We need military documentation or medical records. Franklin stood up slowly, his decision crystallizing with painful clarity. Thank you for your time, ma'am. Ms. Chen, I appreciate everything you've done. Mr. Reeves, where are you going? Sarah asked, alarm in her voice. Back where I belong, Franklin said quietly. I should never have let Alan Judge Whitmore get his hopes up. Some things can't be fixed. As Franklin walked toward the exit, Sarah Chen made a desperate phone call to Judge Whitmore, who was in the middle of a sentencing hearing when his clerk handed him the urgent message. The judge immediately called a recess and contacted his old friend from law school, now a senior partner at a firm that specialized in veterans' rights. But by the time help arrived, Franklin had vanished back into the anonymous maze of Los Angeles's homeless population. For 2 weeks, Judge Whitmore used every resource at his disposal to find the man who'd saved his life. He contacted homeless shelters, police patrol units, and social service agencies. He personally drove through Skid Row searching faces in the crowds of forgotten people who lived in the shadows of the city's prosperity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, the owner of Martinez Market, where Franklin had stolen the bread, called the courthouse after seeing a news story about the judge's search for a homeless veteran. "Judge Whitmore," she said when the call was transferred to his chambers, "I think I know where your friend is." "Where?" "He's been coming to my store every day, just standing outside. He doesn't come in, doesn't ask for anything, just stands there, like he's trying to work up the courage to do something." Judge Whitmore was in his car within minutes, driving through downtown traffic with the urgency of someone racing against time. When he arrived at Martinez Market, he found Franklin exactly where Maria had described, standing on the sidewalk outside the store, staring at the entrance with the expression of someone wrestling with an impossible decision. "Frank," Judge Whitmore called out, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. Franklin turned his face, showing a mixture of shame and relief. "Alan, I was wondering when you'd find me." "Why did you run?" Franklin gestured toward the store. "Because I realized something. I've been stealing bread from this woman for weeks, not just that one time. Taking things when she wasn't looking, telling myself it was survival. But it's not survival, it's giving up." His voice broke. "You saved my life in that courtroom just like I saved yours in Vietnam. But I don't know how to be saved anymore. I don't know how to be anything other than this." Judge Whitmore felt the full weight of his friend's despair, understanding that the real battle wasn't with the VA bureaucracy. It was with the demons that had convinced a war hero that he was worthless. "Frank," he said gently, "let me show you something." Judge Whitmore led Franklin to his car, but instead of driving toward downtown or the VA office, he headed west toward the Pacific Palisades. Franklin sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the city change from urban decay to suburban prosperity, wondering where this journey would end. "Where are we going, Alan?" "To show you what your life meant," Judge Whitmore replied, "what it still means." They pulled into the driveway of a modest but well-maintained house with a carefully tended garden and an American flag hanging from the front porch. Judge Whitmore had called ahead, and the front door opened before they'd even gotten out of the car. "Dad," a woman in her 40s emerged, followed by 2 teenagers and a man who was clearly her husband. "Is this him?" Judge Whitmore nodded. "Frank, I'd like you to meet my daughter Jennifer, her husband Mark, and my grandchildren Sarah and Michael." Franklin stood awkwardly beside the car, overwhelmed by the warmth radiating from this family. Jennifer approached him with tears in her eyes, extending her hand. "Mr. Reeves, I've heard about you my entire life. My father has told us the story of Firebase Charlie so many times that I feel like I was there. Ma'am, Franklin began, but Jennifer interrupted him. You gave me my father, she said simply. You gave me my childhood, my wedding day, the chance to have children of my own. Everything good in my life exists because you crawled through that rice paddy 47 years ago. The teenagers, initially shy, warmed up quickly when Judge Whitmore began telling stories about Franklin's heroism in Vietnam. Michael, 16, and fascinated by military history, peppered Franklin with questions about combat tactics and survival techniques. Sarah, 14, and studying the Vietnam War in school, wanted to know about the human cost of the conflict. Grandpa says you saved his whole squad, Michael said, his eyes bright with admiration. Franklin looked uncomfortable with the attention. I did what any soldier would do. No, Judge Whitmore said firmly. You did what a leader does, what a hero does. Over dinner, the first home-cooked meal Franklin had eaten in years, the conversation flowed from war stories to family updates to dreams for the future. Franklin found himself laughing for the first time in months, feeling the warmth of belonging that he'd thought was lost forever. But the real surprise came after dessert, when Judge Whitmore excused himself to make a phone call. When he returned, his expression was serious but hopeful. Frank, I've been working on something while you were missing. Remember my law school friend, David Kim? He specializes in veterans' rights cases. Franklin nodded, though he was beginning to feel the familiar dread that accompanied discussions of bureaucracy and paperwork. David has been researching your case, and he found something interesting. It turns out that your unit's actions at Firebase Charlie were documented in a classified after-action report that was declassified in 2010. The report specifically mentions Staff Sergeant Franklin Reeves and his actions during the engagement. Judge Whitmore pulled out a folder thick with documents. Frank, you were recommended for the Silver Star. The paperwork was filed, approved, and then somehow lost in the system. You've been entitled to disability benefits based on combat service for 47 years. Franklin stared at the documents, his hands shaking as he tried to process what he was hearing. I don't understand. It means, Sarah Chen said, appearing in the doorway with David Kim, that we can bypass the normal VA process. Your benefits aren't being approved, they're being restored. Kim stepped forward, extending his hand. Mr. Reeves, it's an honor to meet you. I've been working with the VA's Special Claims Unit, and they've agreed to expedite your case based on the declassified documents. You should have your benefits within 30 days. But more than that, Judge Whitmore added, the Army wants to present you with the Silver Star you earned. There's going to be a ceremony. Franklin looked around the room at the faces surrounding him, the judge who owed him a life debt, the lawyer who'd fought the system on his behalf, the family who'd welcomed him as a hero. The weight of their expectations felt overwhelming. I don't deserve this, he said quietly. I'm not the man I was in Vietnam. I'm just a homeless guy who steals bread. Jennifer knelt beside his chair, taking his weathered hands in hers. Mr. Reeves, my father taught me that heroes aren't perfect people. They're people who do the right thing when it matters most. You did that in Vietnam, and you're doing it now by letting us help you. But I gave up, Franklin protested. I walked away from everything. No, Judge Whitmore said firmly. You grieved, you suffered, you carried burdens that would have broken lesser men, but you never stopped being the man who saved my life. The ceremony took place 3 weeks later at the Los Angeles National Cemetery with full military honors. Franklin stood at attention in a dress uniform that fit him better than anything he'd worn in years, surrounded by fellow veterans, Judge Whitmore's family, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by his story. As the general pinned the silver star to his chest, Franklin thought about Dorothy, about the life they'd built together, about the long journey that had brought him to this moment. The medal was beautiful, but it wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the knowledge that his life had meaning, that his service had value, that he was still connected to something larger than his own pain. After the ceremony, as Franklin shook hands with well-wishers and accepted congratulations, Judge Whitmore pulled him aside. "Frank, I have one more surprise for you." He handed Franklin a set of keys. "It's a small apartment, nothing fancy, but it's yours and it's paid for. Consider it back pay for saving my life." Franklin looked at the keys, then at his old lieutenant, now a distinguished judge with silver hair and kind eyes. "Alan, I can't accept this." "Yes, you can, because that's what brothers do. They take care of each other." Franklin felt tears streaming down his face as he embraced the man whose life he'd saved so long ago, understanding finally that salvation was a circle, not a straight line. 1 year later, Franklin Reeves stood before a group of homeless veterans at the downtown Los Angeles VA Center, sharing his story as part of a peer counseling program he'd helped establish. The man who'd once stolen bread to survive now wore a crisp volunteer uniform and carried himself with the dignity of someone who'd reclaimed his purpose. The hardest part, he told the assembled group, wasn't being homeless. It was believing that I deserved to be homeless, that somehow my service didn't matter, that I didn't matter. In the audience, men and women who'd served their country with honor but lost their way listened with the intensity of people hearing their own stories reflected back at them. Franklin's journey from the streets to recognition had become a beacon of hope for veterans who'd given up on the system that had failed them. Judge Whitmore, now retired, attended every session not as a judge, but as a friend. The bond forged in a Vietnamese rice paddy had been strengthened by their reunion, creating a partnership dedicated to helping other forgotten veterans reclaim their lives. The apartment Judge Whitmore had provided had become more than just housing. It was a sanctuary where Franklin had reconnected with family members he'd lost touch with during his years on the streets. His sister had flown in from Ohio, his nephew from Texas, all of them eager to rebuild relationships that homelessness had severed. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simplest one. Franklin had learned to accept help without shame. The man who'd spent years refusing charity now understood that accepting support wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. The Martinez Market, where Franklin's story had begun with a stolen loaf of bread, now employed him part-time as a security guard. Maria Santos had hired him not despite his past, but because of it, understanding that someone who'd experienced rock bottom would be uniquely qualified to help others avoid the same fate. On the wall of the VA Center hung a photograph from Franklin's Silver Star ceremony, surrounded by letters from veterans whose lives had been changed by his advocacy. Below it, a simple plaque bore the words that had become his motto: "Every veteran matters. Every story has value. Every life can be redeemed." Franklin Reeves had learned that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear the scars of service, the wisdom of suffering, and the courage to help others find their way home.